During my PhD, I studied faults and folding process. And in this talk, I would present you three aspects of the faults and folding analysis, which were the main focus of my thesis. And first, I would talk about the quantitative description of the fault shapes, and then the developed tool, fault geometry toolbox. Then, I would talk about theoretical analysis of fault evolution up to large amplitude, and develop theoretical model large amplitude folding. Finally, I would talk about bulk behavior of the folding system, and I would focus on the folding of inclusion-bearing layer. The main motivation of my PhD originated in the Oslo area, where I could observe spectacular structures of folding nodule layers. And where did they form? During the collision between Laurentia and Baltica, the Caledonian Mountains were formed. In the eastern margin of the Caledonian Mountains, the folded thrust belt was formed. Most of the folded thrust belt was removed due to erosion. However, some remnants are still observed in the Oslo Rift. Folded thrust belt developed in Cambrian-Silurian sequence. And this sequence is characterized by the alternating rocks of very different geological behavior. And here in the picture, I present you the sequence of limestones and shales. And what is very interesting in this area, that the limestone layers are not only continuous, but we also see them in form of nodule layers. Rocks are exposed in various places in the Oslo area, but they are widely exposed along the coast. And this is where I did my study using this boat. The main motivation was to understand the formation of fault structures, especially the faults that were formed in the nodule layers. So these are a few pictures from the Oslo Fjord. And I could observe faults that developed on various scales. They had various shapes. And I saw the faults develop in a sequence where I observed continuous layer, but also folded nodule layers. Luckily, I also saw that the individual nodules were deformed. In this particular case, I also observed the pressure solution structures. The rocks and the fault structures in Oslo Fjord are complex, and they're also quite often associated with the thrust, and as I said, various pressure solution structures were formed. So before trying to understand how did this form, I asked a question like, how can I describe these structures? Faults can be described using by humans, and this approach has been tested by Chadwick. He gave fault shape to various geologists and asked them to locate inflection points. It was not really successful. He got the range of the answer and he plotted on the in the histogram. He also made another test when he gave to geologists the fault to analyze twice, but in the second time he used the same fault but rotated 180 degrees. And the answer that he got from the same person were completely different when analyzing the first and second case. It kind of shows that the fault shape analysis for human are very affected by human factor. And it also shows that we need a different, robust tool that can accurately describe the fault shape. I studied the existing methods for tools for the fold shape analysis, but unfortunately I couldn't find any that could be applicable to the generic fold shape. That motivated me to develop the fold geometry toolbox. In this toolbox can accurately describe the fold shape, minimizing operator bias. The usage of normalized parametric curvature allowed me to analyze the generic fold shape, and then allows that the analysis is invariant to the rotation or dilation. I also implemented various smoothing procedures that allow me to analyze noisy interfaces. And here I present two examples of folds. In one case, I generated crazy fold shape synthetically, and in that other case, I took an example of the natural fold from the Western Norway. And in both cases, fold geometry toolbox localizes in hinges and inflection points on the folds. And FGT is the first tool that can reliably describe any fold shape. But having the tool that can quantitatively describe the fold shape, I wanted to make a step further and related the fold geometry with the amount of shortening or the rheological parameters of rocks. And there are various theoretical methods that allow to do that, allow to relate the shortening and viscosity ratio with the set of simple geometrical parameters such as wavelength, thickness, amplitude, and arc length. And I implemented a set of methods in the toolbox. And then I noticed that when analyzing the fold, different folds, I usually got different answers. For example, here in bio, the viscosity ratio is 25, and method from Schmachels and Podlazhikov indicated that viscosity ratio was 100. And I also started to check, compare these results with the results that I obtained from numerical simulations. And I noticed that in some cases, the results that I got from this method were not the same as my input data to my numerical simulations. And that motivated me to look closer at different theoretical models and their limitations. So here I listed these theoretical models, and I checked their applicability to various viscosity ratios, amplitudes, and if they include the process of layer shortening and thickening. And method by bio is restricted to high viscosity ratio, infinitesimal amplitude, and it doesn't incorporate shortening and thickening process. Sherwin-Chapel method, in contrast, it does incorporate the shortening and thickening. The model developed by Fletcher, it can be applied to all range of viscosity ratio, and model by Schmachels and Podlazhikov is the first model that has been developed to analyze large amplitude folds. However, in this case, this model doesn't take into, it's restricted to viscosity ratio. It doesn't take into account the layer shortening and thickening. And I wanted to stress here that these are the classical models of theoretical models that predict the evolution of folds. And here in blue, I put the number of citations. And then we see that these models are classical and highly cited. The most cited work is the work by Bio, which, as you can see, is the most restrictive. And as we see, none of these methods incorporates, is applicable to all viscosity ratios, all amplitudes, and it does take into account layer shortening and thickening. But this is what I did during my PhD. I developed the model which I called LAF. And in the following slide, I would present you how LAF works. Present you first the model setup. It's a little simplified. And I consider a single viscous layer embedded in a viscous matrix. And I assume that both layer and matrix are incompressible, homogeneous, and isotropic. The main goal is to predict the fault shape analysis from any perturbation type. So I employed the Fourier analysis. It means that any perturbation, as for example presented here, can be represented as a sum of simple functions, as a sine and cosine functions. And here, this presented example, I decompose into the series of different waveforms. And here I presented only four first waveform. Each waveform has different amplitude and different wavelength. And the fault evolution is analyzed from the perspective of the change of the amplitude and wavelength of individual waveform. And that's why, for convenience, it's easy to follow these relations, this evolution of fault on the amplitude spectrum. The linear stability analysis predicts that amplitude evolution is given by such a form. The amplitude evolution is driven by the rate of background shortening, and it depends on the amplitude by itself. It means that if we don't have any amplitude, any perturbation imposed on the layer, during the shortening, the layer would only thicken and shorten. If we don't, one in this equation, it refers to passive growth rate. Passive growth rate, it occurs when there's no, the viscosity ratio between layer and matrix is equal to 1. And amplitude evolution of all waveforms would be amplified with the same rate. Q is the active growth rate, and it is the term that is derived, it comes from the mechanical instability, and it's a function of wavelength to thickness ratio and also viscosity ratio. And in LAF, I used the exact solution for the growth rate derived by Fletcher. And here, I present for a specific case, and I chose the viscosity ratio 25. And I plot the diagram of how growth rate depends on wavelength to thickness ratio. And we see that different wavelengths would be amplified with a different rate. And there is one specific wavelength that is amplified most, and this is a dominant waveform, dominant wavelength to thickness ratio. But during the folding, the layer undergoes shortening and thickening. That means that the wavelength to thickness ratio decreases with time. It means also that the growth rate that is dependent on wavelength to thickness ratio would also change. And so when we look at initially the dominant wavelength, because wavelength to thickness ratio changes with time, in this case the growth rate would decrease. Whereas in the other case, for the wavelengths that are larger than the dominant, they would undergo, the growth rate would increase, and they will experience the maximum growth rate. So why is it important to take into account the evolution of growth rate? It is important for the calculation predicting amplification, which is the integral of the amplitude evolution over time. And this is important because the most amplified wavelength is the one that is most probable to emerge in a fault train. So here I plot the amplification as a function of wavelength, initial wavelength to thickness ratio, and I plot it for different times, dimensionless time. Initially, the most amplified waveform, it was the dominant one. But at dimensionless time, 0.5, the most amplified waveform is called preferred waveform, and in this case, it is a different one. And here I want to say that the dimensionless time is a product of rate of deformation and time. But this equation implies that the amplitude grows with the exponential rate. And here I show the example of the amplitude evolution as a function of stretch. And we see how amplitude rapidly grows. However, numerical and analog experiments show that initially, indeed, the layer, the amplitude, undergoes the exponential growth. However, with time, it starts to deviate from this exponential growth. And Schmachels and Podlachikov presented the equation when they took into account this correction, and they stated that the amplitude evolution is not driven by the rate of background shortening, but by the rate of layer shortening rate. And what does it mean? So initially, when the layer is almost flat, the rate of background shortening and rate of layer shortening is the same. However, as the layer starts to deviate from being horizontal, the rate of arc length shortening is smaller than the rate of background shortening. And this causes the slowdown of this exponential growth. And by smaller, I mean in the absolute value smaller. And this factor, this I would refer to as correction factor. The rate of layer shortening can be approximated by the evolution of sinusoidal waveform. And then in lab, we derived the exact formula for the evolution of sinusoidal waveform. The arc length of a single sinusoidal waveform is given as an integral of such a form. We found the solution, analytical solution of such an integral, and we can present the arc length as a function of elliptic integral. Then incorporating this formula into the formula of correction factor, we could derive the exact formula for the correction factor. We also did it for the arc length, which is composed of multiple waveforms. In this case, the arc length is the integral of such a form where all waveforms are taken into account. And as a result, I obtained such a formula for the correction factor. So to summarize LAF, the amplitude evolution in LAF is given by such a form. It combines two corrections. The first correction, it employs the evolution of the wavelength to thickness ratio, which is incorporated with the evolution of growth rate. And also the second correction, the reduction of driving force, is like this C in the formula. Fletcher, in his model, he didn't have a C factor, whereas Schmachels and Podlachikov, they assume the Q to be constant. In LAF, we also improve these corrections, we derived the exact formula for the correction factor. So in order to show you how important it is to use these two corrections simultaneously, I compare LAF with a model of Fletcher and Schmachholz and Podlachikov. And the first one I would refer to as SAS. The second one I would refer to as FAS. And these three models I would compare with finite element results. And here I show the evolution of amplitude as a function of dimensionless time. And I show this for three different waveforms. The waveform that is smaller than the dominant one, equal to dominant one, and larger than the dominant one. And put the names of the different models next to the line that they represent. And we see that in the first case, FAS does not accurately follows the finite element result. In the second case, SAS deviates from numerical results. In the third case, it is both SAS and FAS. And we see that in all cases, LAF accurately follows the numerical results. And LAF provides the best prediction for the evolution of fold geometrical parameters. Here I show the evolution of amplification for a model composed of different waveforms. That's why I plotted amplification as a function of wavelength to thickness ratio for different times. And here I only compare LAF with finite elements because both FAS and SAS are not applicable to such a situation. And in this model, we see that LAF accurately reproduces finite element results. And here I show a picture of how these folds look. And I show the evolution of fold with time. And the fold that is developed numerically is highly irregular, and we see that LAF quite accurately reproduces this irregularity of the fold. But coming back to Oslofjord, now I could quantitatively describe the fold shape. I could understand why the folds develop, how the folds develop into large amplitudes. But there's still one question left. Is what is the role of nodules in the folding process? And here I compared two models. The model where I initially have layer without inclusions embedded in the host rock, and in the other case I have an inclusion-bearing layer. In the first case, I use a viscosity ratio between layer and host equal to 10. In the second case, I use 50% of non-overlapping inclusions. I chose that the inclusions have a circular shape. They are randomly distributed, and they show the wide size distribution. The inclusions are rigid, and the viscosity ratio between layer and host is also 10. This is the two pictures of the simulation after 40% of shortening. And then we see that in the model where I didn't have inclusions, the folds that develop have very small amplitudes. Whereas in the other case, I see that the folds that develop are very prominent. That indicates that the presence of inclusion strengthens the layer. And I check what is the effective viscosity. So in this case, there's effective viscosity between layer and host that I initially used, 10. But when I had inclusions in the model, the effective viscosity ratio between the layer and matrix was 40. Also notice that what I call roughness generation, the inclusions, when they were deformed, the material from between inclusion was expelled and created generations. So presence of inclusion lead to the strengthening of the layer, but also generation of perturbation, which both promote folding. So I know that the inclusion strengthened the layer, and also they strengthen the whole system. But is it permanent strengthening? And I check what it must be the horizontal stress applied in order to keep the rate of deformation constant. That means that all changes in the stress are related to the changes with the effective viscosity ratio, the horizontal effective viscosity of the whole system. And in this system, I use the model where the layer took 10% of the whole model. And instead of analyzing stress, I analyzed the horizontal component, horizontal viscosity component, and normalized by the viscosity ratio, viscosity of the host. And I see that in the model where I didn't have inclusions and the model didn't fold, the strength of the model stayed the same. Whereas where I started in the second model, when I had inclusions, I observed the decrease of the strength when the layers start to fold. And this is often referred in literature to as structural softening. And what I see that, on one hand, inclusions led to the presence of inclusion led to the strengthening of the system. But on the other hand, because of the folding, the strength decreased. And the strength of the system with and without inclusions at the end of simulations are the same. But can we predict this behavior? Yes, we can. We can modify the formula and represent this ratio as a function of this ratio. And this ratio, this can be derived from the correction factor. So there's a relation between the structural softening and the correction factor. So to conclude, during my PhD, I developed tools, fold geometry toolbox, that can reliably describe any fold shape. I also developed LAF, the theoretical model that can predict the fold shape evolution up to large amplitudes. This model is not restricted to any viscosity ratio or any perturbation type. And using FGT and LAF, I could describe the fold shape, understand the evolution of the fold geometry parameters, and also understand the bulk behavior of rocks during folding. Thank you.